Hello and welcome to maybe one of the last video lessons. We shall see. Today we're going to cover the ovarian and menstrual cycles, focusing on the hormones that control them and the negative and positive feedback that works in both mechanisms. So this is a picture of the female reproductive system. Just talk a little bit about the parts, things that you should probably already know, but we shall go over them. So the ovaries are where all the eggs are stored. Females are born with about 30,000 eggs, and they're stored in the ovaries. Once a month, one or sometimes two eggs gets ovulated from the ovaries and travels into the fallopian tubes. And it's in the fallopian tubes that fertilization occurs. If fertilization does not occur, the egg will travel down the fallopian tubes into the uterus, and when the female has her period, the egg will exit the body through the vagina. Now, the uterus, if the egg is fertilized, the fertilized egg will implant itself into the uterus, and that fertilized egg will divide, as we talked about, and eventually become a fetus and then a baby. And then after 9 months, the baby will exit out the uterus through the vagina, and then you'll have a baby. But those are how the parts of the female reproductive system work together. We are now going to discuss the hormones that control ovulation and how they work. So just to beat a dead horse, or beat a sleeping cat, because I have a sleeping cat right next to me, we are going to just quickly review what negative feedback is and positive feedback is. So in negative feedback, the output of the system acts to bring something back to normal or to oppose the changes that are occurring. In positive feedback, instead of opposing or bringing back to normal what's occurring, positive feedback amplifies what's occurring. And both negative and positive feedback function in the female reproductive system, and we are about to see how. The female reproductive system releases the cycle of the last 28 days. So a female will complete one cycle after 28 days pass, not the 30 that everyone thinks it is, or once a month. It's actually 28 days, which is only a month in February. And it has 4 main phases, each of which are controlled by hormones that control the beginning and ending of the phases. So we have the follicular phase, which is where the egg develops in the ovaries. Then we have ovulation, which is when the egg is released from the ovaries. Then we have the luteal phase, which causes the development of the uterine lining to build up with blood. And then if the female is not pregnant, we have menstruation, which is when that lining that was built up gets shed. And menstruation usually lasts anywhere from 3 to 7 days. But again, it does vary for each female. So, to start the cycle, gonadotropin-releasing hormone, which is made in the hypothalamus, talks to the pituitary, if you remember that interplay when we were dealing with the thyroxine hormones, and causes the pituitary to release follicle-stimulating hormone, abbreviated FSH, and luteinizing hormone, abbreviated LH. And it is the FSH that's released by the pituitary that stimulates the growth of the follicle or the development of the follicle in the ovary. We're going to be going back and forth to this slide here. So this sort of shows the whole cycle. If you see GnRH causes the release of FSH and LH, and you'll see here, you see the increase of the FSH levels, and these cause the egg to start developing in the follicle. It does develop in a follicle, but in the ovaries. So, as the follicle is growing in the ovaries, it produces, or begins the production of itself producing estrogen. So if we look back at our graph, we'll see at this point right here, as the follicle is developing here, we start to see the levels of estrogen rise here. Now, what does that cause? High levels of estrogen stimulate the hypothalamus to make the pituitary make a burst of FSH and LSH. This hormone in particular, at its peak, when it peaks, stimulates basically the completion of meiosis, which eggs that are stored in the ovaries are halted in prophase 1, and then ovulation. So if you take a look back at our graph, as estrogen levels rise, they feed back to the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus tells LSA, or tells the pituitary, to increase levels of LH, and you see this huge spike here in both FSH and LSH levels. The spike of LSH triggers ovulation, so it triggers the egg to burst out of the follicle and the ovaries into the fallopian tube. This here is an example of positive feedback in the fact that estrogen, okay, is talking back to the hypothalamus and increasing the amount of LH levels and stimulating ovulation. But this is an example of positive feedback because estrogen is causing the increase or a burst of something to cause ovulation to occur. So at this point, the egg is in the fallopian tubes, waiting to possibly be fertilized by sperm. But after ovulation, the structure that the egg popped out of, which is known as the follicle, starts to develop into something known as the corpus luteum. Now, the corpus luteum secretes both progesterone and estrogen. So if we go back to our chart here, so we see we have the ovulation, and then here we have the development of this corpus luteum. If you see at that point, you'll see that the levels of progesterone, and also the levels of estrogen spike. At the same point, progesterone and estrogen cause the development of the uterine lining to reach its highest point. But it's the job of, so when you get your period, ladies, you can blame the hormone progesterone for causing the development, and estrogen, for causing the development of the uterine lining. Now we have a negative feedback example. When progesterone and estrogen levels are both high, they exert negative feedback in this time on the hypothalamus, keeping the levels of LSH and FSH low. Now, why is this important? This prevents ovulation of a second egg, which you don't want at this point, because you could already be pregnant and don't want the ovulation of a second egg. But this prevents double ovulation within the cycle, the fact that progesterone and estrogen feed back to the system and prevent these from spiking again, and that will be, since these cause the development of the egg and the release from the egg, that will prevent the ovulation of a second egg. Now, as time passes, eventually, the corpus luteum is degraded. Remember, this was the structure that was developing in the ovaries after the egg popped out of the follicle. And because it's degraded, it stops releasing progesterone and estrogen. The end of the secretion of these two hormones causes the uterine lining to be shed. So if we see back here, we have the sort of the degradation of the corpus luteum, and responding to that, the levels of progesterone and estrogen drop, and in response to that, the uterine lining is shed. Then the cycle we begin again with GnRH starting the whole cycle again. And this is repeated about 28 days the cycle takes. It's slightly different in different females. So let's quickly review the hormones in the female reproductive system. I think I'm going to type into here. Alright, so let me exit the program. So the first hormone is GnRH, and that is in the hypothalamus, and it causes the release, it's in caps, it's still in caps, causes the release of LH and FSH. Then we have FSH, and that causes the development of the follicle. Can't spell follicle. Who cares? Spell it right for yourself. It fixed it! Ah! Causes the development of the follicle in the ovaries. Then we have estrogen, which is released by the growing follicle. And this causes two things. It causes a spike in LH, and it also helps the uterine lining develop. Uterine lining develop. Then we have LH, which essentially triggers ovulation. And then last but not least, we have progesterone. And which is not spelled right. Let's see if PowerPoint knows how to spell it. Oh, it does. Look at that. And that causes uterine lining development. So that's a basic overview of the hormones that control the female reproductive system. If we look briefly, again, the purpose of this is to show an example of both negative and positive feedback. So the negative feedback in this system is when estrogen alone is being produced by the growing follicle, and it feeds back positively to the hypothalamus to cause a spike of LH, which triggers ovulation. That's the example of negative feedback. When estrogen by itself, produced by the growing follicle, feeds back and causes the hypothalamus to cause the pituitary to cause a spike of LH, which causes ovulation. Negative feedback is when the corpus luteum is producing both estrogen and progesterone, and when they're both at high levels, they feed back negatively and stop the hypothalamus from causing the pituitary to release LH. This inhibits ovulation for a second time in the cycle. So those are the examples of both positive feedback and negative feedback in the system. Now, a question may follow is, what happens when you're pregnant? And you don't want your uterine lining to shed, because again, you need the uterine lining to feed for the placenta to develop so that you can feed your child during pregnancy. The corpus luteum still degrades, but instead, the embryo, which implants itself into the uterus, secretes human I can never say this word. Another word for you, Hunter! We're just going to call it HCG, gonadotropin hormone. And that hormone maintains the levels of progesterone and estrogen in the body so that the female does not undergo her period. If those levels by accident drop during the pregnancy, sometimes you'll get some breakthrough bleeding during the pregnancy. But it's the growing embryo that secretes these hormones that maintain progesterone and estrogen, and therefore the uterine lining, so that they continuously can take care of the baby. Last question for this PowerPoint is how do birth control pills work? So birth control pills, what they really do is that they regulate hormone levels. And when it would be time to ovulate, what they do is they make the levels of estrogen and progesterone too high, so that when you would normally be ovulating, ovulation is inhibited. So in some ways, this is oversimplified, but again, by artificially increasing the levels of estrogen and progesterone, which are really what's in the pill, usually synthetic form, but that's really what's in the pill, by increasing those levels, they prevent ovulation when you should be ovulating. And if there's no ovulation, there's no chance to get pregnant. That's why if you miss a pill, it may not be effective, because the levels of hormones may not get high enough to inhibit the hypothalamus from telling the pituitary to release LH, and then you might in fact ovulate again. That's why taking every single pill is important, otherwise the levels may not get high enough, the levels of estrogen and progesterone may not get high enough to prevent ovulation. Okay, so now it is your turn to answer the questions that are all both on the hormone thyroxine, which we learned Friday in class, and the human female reproductive system hormones. And I will see you on Monday. I'll say this again on Monday, but Tuesday begins our first review session for the AP exam after school. But I will see you all on Monday. Tests are graded, by the way. See you on Monday.